Now I'll be discussing some of the historical contexts that surround the work of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. As far as we know, again, the author didn't leave any dates in their manuscript for us to know, but as far as we can tell from dating the manuscript, Sir Gawain seems to have been written between 1375 and 1400. And in fact, this week and the next 2 weeks, so 3 weeks in total, we'll be spending in this particular 25-year period. It's the first time we're not jumping ahead by, say, 100 or 200 years. So time to get cozy, get familiar with the politics of this period because it will benefit us for many different texts that we'll be reading. This is also the time period that primarily falls within the reign of Richard II. So sometimes scholars refer to this as Ricardian England. And I just want to highlight two major events of the 14th century that are partially relevant to this text, but will be relevant to other texts in the future as well. The first is the phenomenon of the Black Death in the 1340s, or the bubonic plague. Up to a quarter or a third of the population of Europe was killed by the Black Death during this time, and it was even higher in urban centers like London. 40 years later, this difficulty of the disease combined with pressure from ruling classes led to a very infamous revolt known as the Peasants' Revolt, in which many peasants came together, began to protest, and ultimately revolted against the government for high taxation and other reasons. A lot of these contexts are kind of in the background of Sir Gawain, but aren't immediately relevant. But when we get to Chaucer, the following week, we'll see a lot more connections. As far as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is concerned, a religious context is far more important for thinking about how the context shapes the text and vice versa. As you read Sir Gawain, you'll notice that this text appears to be informed by an interest in careful moral and ethical self-examination, which is part of a broader religious phenomenon of this time period in which many Christians were encouraged to turn inward and examine their heart for impurities, for sins of many kind, that they could then take with them to confession and to be forgiven from. And sin doesn't have to be something tremendously large and salient. It can be very subtle and small, but even though it's subtle and small, that makes it no less harmful. And we can see that reflected in this text as well, in which we are really focusing on very small, minor ethical failures of Gawain, rather than huge, terrible wrongs committed. Finally, the way sin is understood in this text seems to be carefully aligned with notions of chivalry and what constitutes a failure of chivalry. A failure of chivalry seems to be very similar to a sin. Those are the primary contexts that I want to cover, but I also want to spend some time on some of the clothing that people are wearing as well. So if we're looking at our medieval edition of Vogue, we're going to be encountering these looks from the men. First of all, you'll notice that some of the hooped, flared sleeves from the women's clothing of Marie de France's day have now made their way to men's fashion. And the men are also showing a lot more of their legs. And I mention this because I want you to pay attention to how the Green Knight's body is described. The narrator devotes a lot of time to the lower half of the Green Knight's body. So we'll see that coming back. And then finally, I have to draw attention to these amazing shoes, not only because they have bells on them, but also because this particular shoe has been used to date a number of medieval texts that reference those shoes. So fashion is not just fun, it's also historically useful. If we're looking at the women's fashion on this next slide, you'll notice a kind of oversized element to some of the overcoats that they're wearing, almost resembling one of the bibs that Timothée Chalamet wore to an award show years ago. I can't draw any connections to Sir Gawain for this one, but I still think it's fascinating. And that's all I've got for context. After you've read the Sir Gawain text, you can head on over to the Themes in Sir Gawain video.